The Ethelgard building was a shard of steel and glass piercing the gray London sky, a monument to the relentless hum of global finance. Inside, the air was filtered, temperature-controlled, and carried the scent of expensive coffee and ambition. On the 42nd floor, Alistair Finch, CEO of Ethelgard Innovations, watched the silent cityscape. The rain had started smearing the view into a watercolor of blurred headlights and muted neon. To the world, he was a titan, a man who could bend markets to his will, but within the walls of his own life, he was failing. On the tablet before him, the latest report from a Harley Street specialist glowed with clinical detachment. Serafina Finch, age 6, diagnosis selective mutism, profound attachment disorder following maternal death, prognosis guarded. Alistair closed the file with a soft click. Guarded. It was the fourth such report in as many months. Since his wife Eleanor had been stolen from them by a swift and merciless illness, his daughter had retreated into a fortress of silence no one could breach. Serafina, his bright laughing. Sarah had become a ghost in their Kensington apartment, a whisper in the vast polished spaces that now felt achingly empty. 6 years old, and her silence was heavier than the granite foundations of his building. She communicated only through drawings, tangled dark shapes scribbled with black crayon images of cages and broken birds. He had hired the best. A Swiss au pair with a doctorate in child psychology had lasted a week. A renowned American therapist who flew in on a private jet was met with a blank stare. He had filled her room with every toy imaginable, every art supply, even a puppy that now whined sadly outside her permanently closed door. Nothing worked. Kindness was met with a flinch. Touch was met with a retreat so absolute it felt like a physical blow. So he had brought her here to his kingdom of glass. She spent her days in a small, unused office on his floor, a sterile room he had tried to soften with plush rugs and storybooks she never opened. A security camera fed a quiet stream to a corner of his monitor, a constant painful reminder of the daughter he could watch but could no longer reach. Downstairs in the magnificent echoing lobby, Alara Vance pushed her cleaning cart. At 52, she moved not with apology but with a quiet, unshakable grace. Her uniform was a crisp, impersonal navy blue, but she wore it like a vestment. She was a woman of gentle hands and observant eyes, a silent witness to the building's daily dramas. To the young executives who strode past talking loudly into their phones, she was part of the furniture, as invisible as the air they breathed. They did not know that her hands, now wiping away the smudges of their expensive shoes from the marble floor, had once turned the fragile pages of countless storybooks for wide-eyed children. They didn't see the history etched in the fine lines around her eyes, a history of laughter and love, followed by a loss so profound it had taught her the language of silence long before she ever met Serafina Finch. If you wouldn't mind, a sharp voice cut through her thoughts. A young man in a suit too sharp for his years stood impatiently holding out a file. Alara straightened up, moving her cart aside. He didn't wait for her to fully clear the path, striding past and dropping the file onto the reception desk without a word of thanks. Alara watched him go. She had long learned that the truest measure of a person was in how they treated those they believed they did not need. Her gaze drifted across the lobby past the towering ficus trees and the minimalist art and settled on the small office tucked away near the elevators, the one they called the glass nursery. She had seen the little girl. A small, pale figure with hair the color of spun gold walking the corridors with headphones on her eyes, fixed on the floor. The staff whispered about her. The CEO's poor broken daughter. They offered her pitying smiles she never returned, but Alara saw something different. She didn't see a broken thing that needed fixing. She saw a garden left untended in the frost, waiting for a sign of spring. In the quiet rhythm of her work, polishing the brass and wiping the glass, Alara watched. She saw the girl's loneliness, a thing so familiar, it resonated with the hollow space in her own heart. And she waited, though she didn't know what for. She simply knew that in a kingdom made of glass, even the most invisible of queens could see the things a king could not. The late afternoon sun, a rare and precious thing in the London autumn, sliced through the towering glass facade of the Ethelgard building. It cast long, distorted shadows across the lobby, turning the gleaming marble floor into a river of cold fire. The frantic energy of the midday rush had subsided, replaced by the quieter, more intense hum of a day winding towards its close. It was Alara's favorite time. The chaos receded, and the building seemed to breathe, its vast spaces filled with a transient golden light. She was completing her final sweep of the main hall, the rhythmic swoosh thump of her mop a meditative counterpoint to the distant muffled roar of city traffic. The air smelled of her lemon-scented cleaning fluid and the dying warmth of the day. Most of the staff had retreated to their floors, and the lobby had become a cavernous, empty stage. It was in this profound quiet that she first heard it. Not a scream or a wail, but a thin, ragged sound almost too faint to be human. It was the sound of grief trying to hold itself in a hitching sob that was swallowed almost as soon as it was released. Alara stilled her hands, resting on the handle of her mop. Her head tilted, her senses alert. The sound came again, a desperate little gasp seeming to emanate from the forest of monolithic marble pillars that supported the mezzanine. A pang of recognition, sharp and unwelcome, went through her. It was a sound she knew intimately, the sound of a heart breaking in a space too large and empty to offer any comfort. Protocol dictated she should ignore it, or at best report it to the front desk. Her contract was clear: observe clean, do not engage. But this was a pull deeper than protocol. It was the instinct of a mother, a librarian, a woman who knew that some sorrows could not be left alone. Leaving her cart by a potted ficus, she followed the sound. Her soft-soled shoes made no noise on the polished floor. She moved with the same deliberate quiet she applied to her work, not wanting to startle whatever small creature was hiding. Behind the thickest of the pillars, in a deep pocket of shadow untouched by the afternoon sun, she found her. Serafina Finch was curled into a tight ball, her small body racked with tremors. Her face was buried in her knees, and her expensive-looking gray coat was rucked up around her. The oversized headphones she always wore lay discarded beside her, a silent, broken shield. She looked impossibly small and lost against the immense cold stone. For a long moment, Alara simply stood and watched. There was no one else around. The receptionists were busy with a courier, their backs turned. The security guard was making his slow, methodical patrol on the far side of the lobby. This small island of pain was entirely hidden from the world. Alara did not speak. Words she knew were useless here. Words were for grown-ups, for rationalizing and explaining away feelings that had no reason. Words were what all the failed experts had tried. Instead, she did what felt most natural. Her knees creaked softly as she knelt down, the cold of the marble seeping through the thin fabric of her trousers. She folded her hands in her lap and simply sat, sharing the shadow with the girl. Minutes passed. The only sound was Sarah's choked, intermittent sobs. Alara didn't move, didn't sigh, didn't offer a single comforting platitude. She just offered her presence, a quiet, unwavering anchor in the girl's storm. Slowly, the intensity of the crying lessened. The frantic gasps softened into hiccuping breaths. It was then that Alara reached into the deep pocket of her apron, a space that held the quiet debris of a working day, a spare cleaning cloth, a tube of hand cream, a stray mint. Her fingers bypassed them all and closed around a small, soft object. She drew it out. It was a bird no bigger than the palm of her hand, sewn by clumsy, loving stitches. Its body was made from a piece of worn navy blue corduroy, the fabric from a little boy's favorite trousers. One wing was a scrap of faded floral cotton from an old shirt, the other a patch of soft gray flannel. Its eyes were two mismatched black buttons, and its tail was a frayed wisp of yarn. It was imperfect, lopsided, and utterly infused with memory. It was her most precious possession, the story bird. With a movement as gentle as a falling leaf, Alara leaned forward and placed the bird on the cold marble floor in the space between herself and the still curled-up child. She made no sound. She simply placed it there. An offering. A question without words. Then she leaned back, waiting. First the crying stopped completely, replaced by a tense, listening silence. Then slowly, as if emerging from a deep chasm, Sarah's head lifted. Her face was blotchy and tear-streaked, her wide blue eyes swimming with a misery that seemed too vast for her small frame. Her gaze fell upon the little fabric bird. She stared at it for a long time, her breathing hitched, then steadied. A flicker of something other than pain, curiosity, stirred in her expression. Her small hand, which had been clenched into a tight fist, slowly unfurled. Tentatively, like she was afraid it might vanish, she reached out. Her fingers, pale and trembling slightly, hovered over the bird for a second before gently touching the floral cotton wing. The texture was soft, worn, real. She didn't snatch it up. She simply stroked the fabric, her touch becoming surer, her focus absolute. The vast, intimidating lobby, the cold marble, the absent father on the 42nd floor, it all dissolved. In that moment, the world shrank to the space between a grieving child and a small handmade bird. Finally, her fingers closed around it. She drew it towards her, cradling it in both hands, and brought it to her chest. She held it there, her cheek resting against the soft corduroy. Alara watched as the last tremor ran through the child's body and was still. They sat there together side by side in the encroaching twilight, two silent figures in a shared, unspoken understanding. Outside, the city roared on, oblivious. Upstairs in the kingdom of glass, men moved millions of pounds with the tap of a keyboard. But here in the shadows behind the marble, a woman no one ever noticed had just performed the only magic that ever truly mattered. The next day, Alistair noticed a change. It wasn't a breakthrough, not a miracle, but a subtle shift in the tectonic plates of his daughter's silence. For the first time in months, Serafina was not in the small glass office when he checked the security feed. A jolt of pure cold panic shot through him, a primal fear that left his mouth dry. He was about to call security when his eyes scanned the other camera feeds on his screen. And then he saw her. There was a forgotten corner of the Ethelgard building on the 3rd floor, a place the architects had called a winter garden. It had been designed as a tranquil atrium for employees, but in the relentless drive for efficiency, it had been deemed a non-essential luxury. The access door was usually kept locked. The space had fallen into neglect, a glass-roofed ghost of its intended purpose. Ferns grew wild and tangled over the edges of their stone planters, moss crept over the slate floor, and a small ornate fountain in the center was dry, its cherubic statues gathering a fine layer of dust. And it was here in this pocket of forgotten life that he found his daughter. The camera feed was grainy, shot from a high, awkward angle. Alara Vance was there, meticulously wiping down the dusty leaves of an overgrown rubber plant with a damp cloth. And sitting on a cold stone bench a few feet away, clutching the little fabric bird to her chest, was Sarah. She was not crying. She was not drawing her dark, angry pictures. She was simply watching the janitor work with an intensity that Alistair hadn't seen her direct at anything in months. He watched frozen for nearly half an hour. Alara never spoke to the child directly. She just worked her movements calm and unhurried. Occasionally she would glance over and give a small, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement that asked for nothing in return. And Sarah sat a silent sentinel in a secret, overgrown garden. Sarah had found her way there on her own. The previous afternoon, after Alara had left her behind the marble pillar, Sarah had clutched the story bird all the way home. It smelled faintly of lemon polish and something else, something warm and indefinably safe. That night she slept with it tucked under her chin. The next morning at the Ethelgard building, she slipped out of her glass nursery and began to search. She followed the scent of the cleaning fluid, the quiet squeak of the cart's wheels, until she saw Alara unlock the door to the forgotten garden. She had slipped in behind her before the heavy door could click shut. Alara had turned, seen her, and her expression had not changed. There was no surprise, no alarm, no cooing condescension. She had simply held the door open a second longer, then let it close, sealing them both inside the quiet, sun-dappled space. Now, as Alistair watched on his screen, he saw Alara finish with the plants. She carefully folded her cloth, then sat down on the floor, leaning her back against a large stone planter, a comfortable distance from Sarah. The girl's eyes followed her every move. Alara reached down and picked up a small, smooth gray stone, no different from the hundreds of others that lined the planters. She held it in her palm, rubbing its cool surface with her thumb. There was a little stone. Alara's voice was soft, not a performance but a sharing. It was a voice like the rustle of dry leaves. She lived in a garden full of bright, loud flowers. The roses would boast of their color and the lilies of their scent. The little stone had nothing. She was just gray and quiet and ordinary. Sarah leaned forward, just a fraction of an inch. The stone believed she was useless. Alara continued, her eyes on the small object in her hand. She wished she could be red like the roses or white like the lilies. She thought that because she was quiet and plain, she was empty inside. But one morning after a long rain, a single ray of sun came through the clouds and hit her just right. Alara tilted her hand, letting the light from the glass roof catch the stone. And for the first time, the stone saw that she wasn't just gray. She was filled with 1,000 tiny secret sparkles. They had been there all along. She just needed the right light to see them. Alara fell silent. She placed the stone gently on the bench beside Sarah, then closed her eyes, resting. On the screen in his sterile 42nd floor office, Alistair Finch felt something cracked deep inside him. He had spent a fortune on therapies, on behavioral models and cognitive assessments. He had read every book, consulted every expert. They had all come with their complex tools and theories to fix what was broken. And here was this woman, a janitor, with calloused hands and tired eyes, doing more with a common garden stone than they had done with all their degrees and methodologies. A wave of profound, bone-deep relief washed over him, so potent it almost brought him to his knees. His daughter was engaging, she was listening, she was there. But hot on its heels came a more complicated feeling, a baffling, humbling sense of his own powerlessness. He, the great problem solver, had not been the one to find the key. The solution to this impossible, heartbreaking puzzle was not complex or expensive. It was simple. It was human. And it had nothing to do with him. Later that afternoon, when he went to collect Sarah, he found her standing by the door of the winter garden waiting. She was holding the gray stone in one hand and the fabric bird in the other. She was still silent, but as he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away immediately. For a fleeting second, her small fingers rested in his. It was the most contact he'd had with his daughter in half a year. It felt like a lifetime. The visits to the winter garden became a daily ritual, a silent, unstated appointment. Each afternoon around 3, Sarah would slip away from her glass-walled room and make her way to the 3rd floor. Alara, timing her rounds, would be there, and the heavy oak door would click shut behind them, sealing them into their secret world. Alistair watched it all unfold from the cold, digital distance of his office monitor. He felt like an astronomer discovering a new, faint star, afraid that looking too closely might make it disappear. He saw his daughter, who had rejected a roomful of bespoke toys, sit captivated as Alara told a story about a spider who was afraid of heights, using only a piece of fallen twine. He saw her, a child who refused meals prepared by a private chef except a single slightly bruised apple that Alara polished on her apron and offered without a word. There was no agenda, no therapeutic framework. There was only quiet company and simple stories spun from the discarded objects of the world: a fallen leaf, a lost button, a feather. The changes in Sarah were small, almost imperceptible to the outside world, but to Alistair, they were seismic. One evening, as he was helping her take off her coat, a small gray stone fell from her pocket and clattered onto the polished floor of their apartment. Before, she would have ignored it, letting it lie where it fell. This time, she immediately bent down, a look of genuine distress on her face, and snatched it up. She cradled it in her hands, her shoulders relaxing, only when she had safely tucked it back into her pocket alongside the ever-present storybird. She was caring for something again. The true shift came on a Thursday evening, a week after the first garden meeting. Rain lashed against the windows of their Kensington home, the wind howling a lonely lament. Alistair was sitting in his study, trying and failing to focus on a quarterly earnings report. The numbers swam before his eyes, meaningless symbols compared to the complex, unsolvable equation of his daughter. Sarah padded into the room, a rare event in itself. She usually remained in her bedroom, a silent island in their sea of an apartment. She stood in the doorway, a small, pajama-clad figure holding the fabric bird. "Sarah, sweetheart, are you all right?" he asked gently, his voice betraying a nervous hope. She walked over to his desk. For a few moments, she just stood there, looking not at him, but at the picture of her mother. Her finger traced the line of Eleanor's smile on the silver frame. Alistair held his breath. She turned her gaze to him. Her eyes, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, seemed to be truly seeing him, not looking through him. Her small voice, when it came, was husky from disuse, fragile as a bird's egg. "The ladies, the talking ladies, they always tried to fix my quiet." Alistair's heart hammered against his ribs. He didn't dare move. The talking ladies was her term for the parade of therapists and psychologists. They said the quiet was a bad thing. She whispered, her gaze dropping to the fabric bird in her hands, like a broken toy. She looked up at him again, and her blue eyes were clear, holding a flicker of the old fierce intelligence he had missed so desperately. "Alara doesn't," she said, her voice a fraction stronger. "She doesn't talk to me like I'm broken. She makes the quiet have stories in it." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. She makes the quiet have stories in it. In one simple, devastatingly profound sentence, his 6-year-old daughter had articulated what a legion of experts had missed. They had seen her silence as a void to be filled, a problem to be solved, a malfunction to be repaired. Alara had seen it as a space that simply needed to be shared. He felt a sudden sharp sting behind his eyes. He reached out his hand, trembling slightly, wanting to touch her, to pull her into a hug. But he stopped himself, terrified of shattering the fragile moment. "I see," he managed to say, his own voice thick with emotion. Sarah seemed to find this a satisfactory answer. She gave a small, solemn nod, then turned and padded silently out of the room. Alistair sat there for a long time, the meaningless numbers on his screen blurring into a gray haze. The silence she left behind was different. It wasn't the empty, oppressive silence of before. It was a silence that now held an echo of his daughter's voice. It was a silence that held stories. That night, long after Sarah had fallen asleep, Alistair went into her room. The puppy was curled up at the foot of her bed, another small victory he hadn't dared to acknowledge. The storybird was nestled on the pillow beside her head. On her small bedside table was a sheet of paper. He picked it up. It was a drawing, but not like the others. This one was in color, a shaky, childish rendering of two figures sitting in what was unmistakably a garden. One larger figure in a blue dress, one smaller figure beside her, and flying between them, connecting their two crudely drawn hands, was a small, brightly colored bird. It wasn't broken. It was flying. Beneath the picture, in wobbly, hesitant letters, was a single word: Alara. A wave of fierce, protective gratitude washed over him. This woman, this janitor, this stranger had given him back a piece of his daughter. It wasn't magic. It was something far more rare and powerful. It was understanding. And in that moment, Alistair Finch, the man who controlled a global empire, knew he had to understand. He had to know who this woman was. He returned to his study, sat down at his desk, and sent a single encrypted email to his head of security, a man whose loyalty was absolute. The message was brief. Find out everything you can about Alara Vance, discreetly. The last bus of the night hissed to a stop, its brakes groaning a weary complaint against the damp Brixton air. Alara stepped off, pulling the collar of her thin coat tighter against a wind that carried the scent of wet pavement and distant fried chicken. The vibrant, chaotic energy of the high street faded behind her as she turned onto her quiet residential road, a street of terraced brick houses, their windows glowing with the soft, inviting light of other people's lives. Her flat was on the ground floor of a converted Victorian house. It was small, meticulously clean, and profoundly quiet. To most, it would seem a lonely place, but to Alara it was a sanctuary. Here, she was not invisible. Here, she was simply herself, surrounded by the ghosts of a life richly lived and deeply mourned. After a simple meal of toast and tea, she went through her nightly ritual. She washed her cup and plate, wiped down the counter, and checked that the front door was double-locked. Each action was deliberate, a small anchor in the vast, silent ocean of her evening. Finally, she went to the wardrobe in her bedroom. Tucked away at the back behind her few neatly hung uniforms and a single church dress was a small, unadorned wooden box. It was made of a dark, heavy wood, its lid smooth and cool to the touch. It was not a jewelry box or a memory chest bought from a shop. It had once held her father's woodworking tools. Now it held the entire world she had lost. She carried it to her small armchair by the window and sat down, placing it carefully on her lap. For a long time, she just rested her hands on the lid, feeling the familiar grain of the wood beneath her palms. Opening the box was a pilgrimage, a journey she did not take lightly. Some nights the grief was a sharp physical thing, and the lid remained closed. But tonight, the face of a small, silent girl with haunted blue eyes had stirred something within her, a need to remember not just the pain, but the joy. With a soft, resigned sigh, she lifted the lid. The first thing that always hit her was the scent. A faint, irreplaceable smell of old paper, faded cotton, and the ghost of a little boy's unique scent. A mix of sunshine, playground dirt, and the sweet, milky smell of his skin. Inside, nestled in soft tissue paper, were the relics of her son, her Leo. Her fingers, calloused from years of work, moved with a tenderness reserved for the most fragile of things. She picked up a small bundle of fabric scraps tied together with a faded red ribbon. These were the pieces she hadn't been able to use for the storybirds she occasionally made. A square of denim from his first pair of proper jeans. A piece of a yellow t-shirt with a cartoon lion printed on it, the lion's face worn away from countless washes. The soft brushed cotton from his favorite pajamas, the ones with tiny rockets on them. She held them to her face, closing her eyes, breathing in the faint echoes of his presence. Beneath the fabrics was a stack of old library cards, the kind they don't use anymore, with dates stamped in purple and black ink. Where the wild things are. The tiger who came to tea. The Iron Man. His name was written at the top of each in her own neat librarian script, Leo Vance. She smiled faintly. He had been a devourer of stories, a child who lived as much in the worlds of Narnia and Middle-earth as he did in South London. Her life before had been filled with stories. For 15 years, she had been the head children's librarian at the local community library. It hadn't been a job, it had been a calling. Her small corner of the building was a kingdom of wonder, a safe harbor for the children of the neighborhood. She knew them all by name, knew which ones needed stories of adventure, which ones needed tales of quiet comfort, and which ones just needed a safe place to sit for an hour after school. Her Leo had grown up there, sleeping in his carry cot behind the circulation desk, taking his first steps in the picture book section. She had been a different woman then. A woman whose laughter came easily, a woman who believed in the simple, uncomplicated power of a happy ending. Then came the fire. Her fingers trembled as they reached the bottom of the box. There was a single folded newspaper clipping. The headline was stark brutal. Fatal blaze in council block linked to faulty wiring. She didn't need to read the article. The words were burned into her memory. It hadn't even been their flat. It had started 2 floors below, a slow, creeping smoke in the dead of night. She remembered the alarm, the confusion, the thick, acrid blackness. She remembered screaming his name, her hands scrabbling uselessly against the melting heat of his bedroom door. She remembered a fireman's arms pulling her back, and then nothing. Leo was 7. He had loved building things with popsicle sticks and had a smile that she had always believed fix bad days. After that, the stories stopped. The library became a house of ghosts, every colorful book a painful reminder. She couldn't bear the sympathetic eyes of the mothers, the innocent questions of the children. So she had walked away, disappearing into the anonymous world of contract cleaning. It was a life of silence, of quiet observation. It was safe. She had learned to move through the world without leaving a trace, to clean away the messes of others without ever having to confront her own. For 10 years, this box had been her only connection to the woman she used to be. For 10 years, the storybird had remained tucked away in her apron, a silent, painful secret, until a little girl with Eleanor's eyes and Alistair's sorrow had cried behind a marble pillar. When she sat with Seraphina in the secret garden telling stories with stones and leaves, she felt a flicker of the old Ilara return. It was a fragile, tentative thing, like a winter shoot pushing its way through frozen ground. It hurt. It felt like a betrayal of her grief, a grief she had worn for a decade like a heavy protective cloak. But when she saw the flicker of life in Sarah's eyes, the faintest hint of a smile at the corner of her lips, she knew she could not stop. Pain, she knew, recognizes pain. And a story she had always believed was a bridge you build across the silent, terrifying chasm of grief, not to escape it, but to find a hand to hold on the other side. She gently placed the lid back on the box. The past was safe, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a fragile, terrifying whisper of the future. The sky had been a flat, pearlescent gray all day, and a soft, persistent drizzle was now whispering against the glass roof of the winter garden. The sound created a gentle, cocooning hush, separating the neglected atrium from the rest of the building's sharp corporate hum. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, a scent of honest, natural life that couldn't be found anywhere else in the pristine Ethelgard Tower. Ilara was tending to a lonely, struggling orchid she'd found tucked behind a cluster of overgrown ferns. Its blooms had long since fallen, and its leaves were a pale, tired green. With a tenderness she hadn't felt for a living thing in years, she was clearing away the dead foliage and gently loosening the soil with her fingertips. Sarah sat on the stone bench nearby, not watching Ilara, but the storybird, which she had placed carefully in the center of the bench. She ran a single small finger over the mismatched buttons that served as its eyes. She was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was a thoughtful, observant silence, not the vacant, defensive one of weeks past. Alara finished her task and sat on the floor, leaning against the cool slate of a planter. For a while they shared the comfortable silence, listening to the rain's gentle drumming. Sarah picked up the bird, her thumb stroking the worn corduroy of its body. She had asked about the stories, if the stone was still sparkly, if the spider ever learned to climb, but she had never asked about the bird itself. It was as if she understood with a child's deep and wordless intuition that this object was different, that it held a heavier story. Today, something had changed. She looked from the bird to Alara, her blue eyes serious and direct. "This bird," she began, her voice barely louder than the rain. "The story bird. Did you make it for someone?" The question, so simple and innocent, landed in the quiet space between them with the weight of a stone. Alara's hands, which had been resting loosely in her lap, stilled. The air seemed to grow thick, heavy. Every instinct she had cultivated over the past decade screamed at her to deflect, to retreat, to build a wall of gentle but firm silence. "That's a private thing, sweet girl. Let's talk about something else." The words were on the tip of her tongue. But looking at Sarah's face, at the genuine open trust in her eyes, Alara found she could not say them. This child had shown her a vulnerability so pure and absolute that to offer anything less than the truth felt like a betrayal. 40 floors up, the only sound in Alistair's office was the soft click of his mouse and the distant muted siren of a passing emergency vehicle. He had been staring at his inbox for an hour. His focus shattered. A single unread email sat at the top of the list. The sender was his head of security. The subject line was chillingly discreet. "Regarding your inquiry." His finger hovered over the trackpad. A war was raging within him. This was a gross invasion of privacy. Alara Vance was his employee, nothing more. He had no right to dig into her past, to peel back the layers of her life like a common investigator. It felt sordid, a misuse of the power and resources at his command. But then his gaze drifted to the small live feed window on his screen. He saw the two of them in the garden, and the image of his daughter's drawing from the other night flashed in his mind, the two figures connected by a flying bird. This wasn't about an employee. This was about the woman who had reached into an impossible darkness and found his daughter's hand. He had to know. He had to understand the source of her quiet, powerful magic. With a deep breath, he clicked. The file opened. It was a standard background check compiled from public records and old databases, cold, hard facts in a clinical font. Name, Alara M. Vance. Date of birth, 17 March 1973. Current residence, Brixton, London. He scrolled down. The work history was sparse for the last decade, a series of cleaning contracts with third-party facility management companies. But then he saw the entry from before. Employment history, 1995-2015, London Borough of Lambeth. Position head, Children's Librarian, Brixton Central Library. A librarian, of course. The stories, the gentle voice, it made a sudden painful kind of sense. He scrolled further, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. Personal history. No criminal record, no outstanding financial issues. One significant event of public record. He paused, then scrolled down to the final stark entry. Note: subject was a survivor of the Elm Court Tower fire in March 2015. Residential fire official cause listed as faulty electrical wiring. One fatality was registered at the subject's address. Alistair leaned closer to the screen, his throat tightening. Deceased Leo M. Vance, age 7, relation son. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air rushed out of his lungs. 7, the age his own daughter would be next year. He stared at the words, the name Leo, and a wave of profound, gut-wrenching empathy washed over him. The image of this quiet, graceful woman scrubbing floors and polishing glass shattered and reformed into something entirely new. She wasn't just a janitor. She was a mother who had lost her child, a woman whose entire world had been reduced to ash. And yet she had found it within herself to sit with his daughter and tell stories about finding sparkles in a plain gray stone. In the garden, Alara finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A single crystalline tear welled in her eye and traced a slow, hot path down her cheek. She looked at Sarah, not with pity or for pity, but with a simple, unvarnished honesty. "Yes," she whispered, her voice cracking just once. "I did. I made it for my son. His name was Leo." She didn't offer any more. She didn't explain the fire, the smoke, the silence that followed. She just offered the name a sacred, precious gift. Sarah listened, her expression unchanging. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't say she was sorry. Her 6-year-old heart understood a simpler, more profound truth. It understood sadness. Slowly, she shuffled closer on the bench. She took the hand that Alara had resting on her knee, her small, warm fingers wrapping around Alara's. Then she leaned over and rested her head gently against Alara's arm. It was a gesture of pure, uncomplicated comfort. A small body offering its warmth, its presence against an impossibly large sorrow. Alara closed her eyes, the tear finally falling from her chin. Without a word, she wrapped her free arm around Serafina's small shoulders, pulling her close. And there they sat in the dusty, forgotten garden as the rain pattered on the glass above them, two broken hearts holding each other up. The invisible threads connecting Alara and Serafina in their secret garden began to ripple outwards, disturbing the carefully ordered ecosystem of the Ethelgard building. At first it was just whispers. A junior accountant mentioning to a colleague that he'd seen the CEO's daughter, the silent one, actually smiling near the old atrium. A receptionist noting the janitor's name, Alara, for the first time, wondering why the Finch girl seemed to follow her like a duckling. Alistair, however, was no longer watching from a distance. The knowledge of Alara's past had transformed his perspective. He saw her now not as an anomaly or a fortunate coincidence, but as a woman of incredible hidden strength. He began to subtly facilitate their meetings. He instructed security to ensure the winter garden was left unlocked in the afternoons. He had a quiet word with the catering manager, and a small carton of milk and a biscuit began to appear on a tray near the garden door each day, left anonymously. His gratitude was immense, but it made him careless. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, to rearranging the world to suit his needs. He failed to appreciate how a deviation from the established order, no matter how small or well-intentioned, would be perceived by those who thrived on that order. The first real tremor came from the 42nd floor. It came in the form of Lord Harrington. Marcus Harrington was a relic of a bygone era, a non-executive board member who had inherited his seat along with a title and a sprawling estate in Surrey. He was a man of old money, old rules, and a deep-seated belief in the natural hierarchy of things. To him, Ethelgard Innovations was a vulgar but profitable enterprise, and his role was to ensure it maintained a veneer of British respectability. He had summoned Alistair to an informal chat in the executive boardroom, a vast, sterile space dominated by a 20-foot slab of polished mahogany. Harrington stood by the window, his Savile Row suit immaculate, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He looked less like a board member and more like a hawk surveying its territory. "Alistair," he began, his voice smooth as aged port, "a concerning rumor has reached my ears about your girl." Alistair's posture stiffened. "Serafina is my private concern, Marcus. Everything a CEO does is a concern of the board." Harrington countered, turning from the window. His eyes were a pale, cold blue. "They're saying you're allowing her to spend her days with one of the cleaning staff. A woman. Colored woman, I believe?" He said the word with a distaste so subtle it was almost imperceptible, yet it hung in the air like a foul odor. "Her name is Alara Vance," Alistair said, his voice dangerously level, "and she has helped my daughter more than your entire network of Harley Street specialists combined." Harrington gave a thin, dismissive smile. "I'm sure she's a perfectly decent charwoman, but you must see the optics, my boy. The CEO's daughter consorting with the hired help. It suggests a lack of control. It's unseemly. What if she's filling the child's head with nonsense? There are protocols, vetting procedures, liabilities to consider. The only thing I'm considering is my daughter's well-being." Alistair snapped, his patience fraying. "And we are considering the companies," Harrington retorted, his voice hardening. "This is a place of business, not a social experiment. The investors value stability, predictability. This little arrangement of yours is anything but. End it. Quietly." The unspoken threat was clear. Alistair was the CEO, but men like Harrington held the old, deep-rooted power. He left the boardroom with a cold knot of fury in his stomach. The conflict was no longer a private matter of gratitude. It was a battle line being drawn. Downstairs, the same prejudice was manifesting in a cruder, more direct form. Alara was a veteran of navigating the subtle and overt slights of her position. She knew the sting of a door being shut in her face, the humiliation of a casually discarded piece of trash flicked in her direction. She had built a fortress of dignity around herself, a quiet refusal to be diminished. But the whispers were now louder, sharper. They were about her and Van the child. The ugliest moment came that afternoon. She was in the small kitchenette on the 30th floor refilling her spray bottle. Two young female assistants dressed in identical sharp-shouldered blazers were by the coffee machine talking in conspiratorial tones. "It's just bizarre," said the first one, a blonde named Chloe, whom Alara knew was Lord Harrington's executive assistant. "He could hire the best nanny in the world, and he has his daughter following the cleaner around like a lost puppy. I heard she's got some kind of hold over the girl." The other one added, stirring her latte with a clatter. "Probably just wants a payout. You know how they are." Alara's back was to them. She focused on the gurgle of the water filling her bottle, her knuckles white where she gripped the plastic. "Don't engage. You are invisible. There is safety in being invisible." Chloe then walked towards the bin, which was right next to where Alara was standing. She was holding a half-full cup of coffee. With a look of deliberate, disdainful carelessness, she tossed the cup towards the bin. It missed spectacularly. Lukewarm coffee and milk splashed across the clean floor and splattered onto Alara's navy blue trousers and sensible shoes. "Oh dear," Chloe said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "So clumsy of me. Good thing you're here to clean it up." The other assistant snickered. For a heartbeat, the old Alara, the respected librarian, the proud mother, wanted to rise up to meet the girl's cruel gaze and shame her with a quiet, powerful dignity. But 10 years of learned subservience held her in place. To react was to risk everything. Her job, her peace, the fragile connection she had with Sarah. Without a word, she knelt her knees protesting. She took a cloth from her cart and began to wipe up the sticky brown mess, the scent of stale coffee filling her nostrils. The two women watched her for a moment, then turned and walked out of the kitchenette, their heels clicking a triumphant rhythm on the floor. Alara stayed kneeling for a long time after the mess was gone. The splash of coffee wasn't the insult. The insult was the chilling confirmation that her bond with Sarah wasn't seen as a kindness or a small miracle. It was seen as a transgression, a violation of an unspoken but brutally enforced code. She had crossed a line from the broom closet into the boardroom, and now the kingdom was pushing back. The institutional pushback began the very next morning. It arrived not with a bang, but with the sterile bureaucratic whisper of a corporate email. Alistair was in his office, the confrontation with Harrington still a sour taste in his mouth, when a message from Human Resources landed in his inbox. It was flagged with a red exclamation mark for urgency. Subject, formal complaint and contractual review, Oak Haven Facilities Management. He opened it, a sense of dread tightening his chest. The email was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak. It referenced a formal complaint lodged by Oak Haven, the third-party company that held the cleaning contract for the entire building. The complaint, it stated, concerned one of their employees, Ms. Alara Vance, who had been observed engaging in activities significantly outside the scope of her contractual duties. It mentioned unauthorized and prolonged interaction with a minor on the premises and cited potential breaches of insurance and liability protocols. The message was clear. Someone had made a phone call, Harrington most likely. He had bypassed a direct confrontation and had instead pulled the levers of the corporate machine, a machine designed to crush such inconvenient human irregularities. The email concluded with a chillingly polite recommendation. To mitigate any potential legal or professional risks, we advise that Ms. Vance's access to the executive floors be restricted and that her duties be reassigned to a less sensitive area of the building pending a full review. A cold, hard fury, unlike anything Alistair had felt in years, settled over him. Less sensitive area. They were talking about her as if she were a chemical spill, a hazard to be contained. They wanted to banish her to the car park or the sub-basement, to sever the fragile lifeline she had thrown to his daughter. He knew this was just the first move. If he ignored it, the pressure would escalate. The board would be officially notified. Investors would be made aware of a potential governance issue. It was a slow, methodical strangulation, and Alara was the one whose air was being cut off. He spent the rest of the day in a state of agitated paralysis, canceling meetings and pacing his office. He was a king in a glass castle, and he was discovering that the walls were far more fragile than he'd ever imagined. He felt trapped between his duty to his company and his fierce paternal need to protect the one person who had been able to reach his child. By late afternoon, he knew he couldn't let the day end without speaking to her. He couldn't summon her to his office. That would feel like an interrogation, a confirmation of her subordinate status. He had to meet her on her own ground. He found her on the rooftop terrace, a space rarely used in the autumn. A biting wind whipped across the manicured decking, snatching at the edges of her coat. She wasn't cleaning. She was standing at the glass balustrade looking out at the sprawling, indifferent city below. Her shift was nearly over. The sky was a bruised purple and the lights of London were beginning to glitter like a cold, scattered galaxy. She heard him approach but didn't turn. "They've made a complaint," he said, his voice nearly lost to the wind. There was no point in pretending. "The cleaning company. HR is involved." Alara continued to stare at the horizon. "I see," she said, her voice calm and even. She had been expecting it. The incident with the spilled coffee had been a prelude, a warning shot. "They want to move you." Alistair continued, frustration making his words clipped. "They're talking about liability insurance. Protocol." He hated how weak the words sounded, how inadequate they were to describe the human cruelty at the heart of the matter. Finally, Alara turned to face him. Her hair was tied back in a simple scarf, but the wind had pulled loose a few stray strands that whipped across her face. Her eyes were not angry or frightened. They were filled with a profound, weary clarity. "I can't cause you trouble, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice steady despite the wind. "This arrangement, it was never going to last. I won't let them do it," he said with more conviction than he felt. "You've saved my daughter. I owe you everything." A faint, sad smile touched Alara's lips. "You don't owe me anything. Seeing a little bit of the light come back into that child's eyes is more payment than I've had in a decade." She paused, her gaze turning inward for a moment. "But I don't need your pity, Mr. Finch, and I don't need a favor. All I've ever wanted is peace, a quiet place to do my work and be left alone." Her voice cracked just for a second, a fissure in her carefully constructed composure. "When I'm with her, with Serafina, it's like the quiet isn't empty anymore. But I can't be the cause of a storm in your world. It isn't my place." She pulled her coat tighter around herself. "Let me go. Let them move me to the basement. It will be for the best. I will be fine. And Sarah, she is stronger now. She will be fine too." He stood there silenced by her dignity, her willingness to sacrifice her own small comfort for his. She was offering him an easy way out, a return to the neat, ordered world he was supposed to command. But as he looked at her standing tall against the wind and the fading light, he knew that taking that easy way out would be an act of profound cowardice. It would mean siding with the Harringtons of the world. It would mean teaching his daughter that kindness has a price, and that when it becomes inconvenient, you stop paying it. He couldn't do it. But as the wind howled around them, he had no idea how to fight back. The conversation on the rooftop left Alistair feeling hollowed out, the wind having scoured away his resolve, leaving only a cold, gnawing indecision. Alara's quiet resignation was a far more powerful indictment than any angry accusation could have been. She was prepared to disappear back into the shadows to protect his peace. The nobility of it was crushing. He walked back to his office, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The path of least resistance was clear. Agree with HR. Allow Alara to be reassigned and hire a team of the best vetted, most professionally appropriate tutors and companions for Sarah. It was the logical strategic move. It would appease Harrington, placate the board, and make the problem vanish. He could even arrange a generous severance package for Alara, a quiet financial thank you that would clear his conscience. He sat at his desk, staring at the cityscape now, a brilliant, anonymous tapestry of light. He was drafting the email in his head, choosing the cold corporate words that would seal Alara's fate. In light of the concerns raised, to ensure full compliance, the well-being of all parties, each phrase felt like a betrayal. A small sound from the doorway made him turn. Serafina was standing there. She was supposed to be in the glass nursery with the evening sitter he'd hired, a university student who mostly read magazines, but she had slipped away. She was in her stockinged feet, her coat still on, and her face was pale, her eyes wide and unnervingly perceptive. She was clutching the storybird so tightly her knuckles were white. She must have followed him from the rooftop. She must have been standing in the corridor, listening. "Daddy!" Her voice was a small, trembling whisper the first time she had called him that in what felt like a lifetime. Alistair's carefully constructed arguments crumbled to dust. "Sarah, sweetheart, you should be with Emily." She took a hesitant step into the room, then another. She was looking at his face, her gaze searching full of a terrifying childish wisdom. She knew. He didn't know how, but she knew. Are you sending Alara away?" She asked, the words tumbling out in a rushed, fearful breath. The directness of the question disarmed him completely. All the corporate jargon, all the strategic thinking evaporated. He was just a father caught in a lie before he'd even had a chance to tell it. It's complicated, Sarah." He began, the words sounding feeble and false even to his own ears. "No, it's not," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength, a strength born of pure desperation. She took another step now, standing right beside his desk looking up at him. Her lower lip trembled. "It's what you always do. It's what everyone does. When someone good comes, you make them leave." The accusation, so simple and so true, pierced him to the core. The nannies, the therapists, the well-meaning friends of his late wife, he had dismissed them all, paid them off, sent them away when they had failed to produce the results he wanted. He had treated his daughter's grief like a failing business venture, liquidating assets that didn't perform. Tears began to well in her eyes, big silent tears that broke his heart. "I lost Mummy," she whispered, her voice cracking each word a tiny shard of glass. "And I don't want to lose Alara too." She wasn't just talking about the potential departure of a friend. She was talking about the deepest, most primal fear a child can have, the fear of abandonment, of losing the fragile anchors of safety in a world that had already proven itself to be terrifyingly unstable. Alara had become her anchor. She was the calm harbor in the storm of her grief, and now her own father was preparing to sink the ship. In that moment, Alistair saw his choice with a blinding, brutal clarity. This was not about the board, or the stock price, or Lord Harrington's antiquated prejudices. It was about the little girl standing before him, her world threatening to shatter for a second time. It was about the promise he had made to Eleanor at her bedside, the promise to always, always protect their daughter. Protecting her wasn't about shielding her from the world's dangers. It was about ensuring her world had people like Alara in it. He felt something shift deep within him, a tectonic realignment of his priorities. The fear of the board, the anxiety about his position, it all burned away, replaced by a clean, white-hot certainty. He slid off his chair, kneeling on the expensive carpet, so he was at eye level with his daughter. He reached out, not to touch her, but just to hold his hands out in open, honest gesture. "No," he said, his voice thick with emotion, but unwavering. "I'm not sending her away. I promise you, Sarah. Alara is not going anywhere." Sarah's tear-filled eyes searched his, looking for the slightest hint of a lie. She found none. The terror in her expression slowly, cautiously began to recede, replaced by a fragile, trembling hope. She took a final small step and leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. Her small hand, the one not clutching the bird, came up and rested on his cheek. It was a gesture of forgiveness, of trust, of a bond he had feared was broken forever. He closed his eyes, overwhelmed. He had been trying to fix his daughter's broken heart. He had never realized that the first step was to fix his own. The decision was made. He was no longer a CEO weighing risks and liabilities. He was a father, and he was ready for a fight. The following morning, the atmosphere on the 42nd floor was electric with a new and unfamiliar energy. Alistair Finch had arrived at dawn, not with his usual air of quiet, burdened authority, but with the focused, almost serene intensity of a general on the morning of a decisive battle. His instructions to his assistant were precise and non-negotiable. Cancel my day, all of it, and schedule an emergency meeting of the board. In person. Here. 1 hour. An hour later, they began to file in. Lord Harrington arrived first, his expression a mixture of surprise and smug satisfaction, clearly believing the meeting was Alistair's capitulation. The others followed, seasoned financiers, shrewd tech investors, and legal counsels, their faces a canvas of curiosity and concern. They took their seats around the vast mahogany table, the City of London, a silent panoramic witness behind them. Alistair remained standing at the head of the table. He did not ask them to sit, nor did he offer coffee. He let the silence stretch, forcing them to meet his gaze. Thank you for coming on such short notice. He began, his voice calm, devoid of anger, but resonating with an iron authority they hadn't heard in months. This meeting is to address a matter of personnel, a matter I now consider to be the single most important issue facing the future of this company. A few of them exchanged puzzled glances. Harrington shifted in his seat, a flicker of unease in his cold eyes. As some of you are aware, Alistair continued, his eyes locking onto Harrington. Concerns have been raised about an employee of a third-party contractor, a cleaning woman named Alara Vance, and her relationship with my daughter. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. I have been advised to handle this quietly, to reassign her to eliminate the perceived liability. This is the prudent, risk-averse, established way of doing things. It is also an act of profound corporate and moral cowardice, and I will not be a party to it. A stunned silence fell over the room. Board meetings at Ethelgard were about numbers, projections, and market strategy. They were not about morality. Let me be clear, Alistair said, placing his hands flat on the table. Ms. Vance is a former children's librarian who, after suffering an unimaginable personal tragedy, has been working in anonymity for the last decade. In the space of a few weeks, she has accomplished what a legion of paid experts could not. She has brought my daughter back from a place of profound trauma and silence. She did this not with therapy or medication, but with kindness, patience, and the simple human act of telling a story. She is without question the most valuable asset to have walked through the doors of this building this year. He picked up a tablet, and with a tap, the projector screen behind him lit up. It was not a graph or a spreadsheet. It was a high-resolution photograph of the drawing Sarah had made, the two figures in the garden connected by the flying bird. This, Alistair said softly, is the only metric, the only KPI that has mattered to me for the past 6 months, and it is a metric that is off the charts. He turned the screen off. Therefore, I am not reassigning Ms. Vance. I am promoting her. The room erupted in a flurry of muffled gasps and confused murmurs. Harrington slammed his leather-bound folio onto the table. Alistair, this is madness. You can't be serious. Promote the janitor to what, head of sanitation? His voice dripped with scorn. No, Marcus Alistair replied, his voice dangerously quiet, to something far more important. He took a breath. Effective immediately, Ethelgard Innovations is terminating its contract with Oakhaven Facilities Management. He looked around the table. And in its place, we are establishing a new internal initiative. It will be a fully funded permanent division of this company dedicated to child wellness and emotional development for the families of our employees. He let that sink in before delivering the final decisive blow. This initiative will be called the Leo's Bridge Foundation. He saw the flicker of recognition on the faces of those who had read the security report he had quietly forwarded to them 10 minutes before the meeting began. Harrington's face went pale, and its founding director, Alistair, concluded, his voice ringing with finality, will be Ms. Alara Vance. She will be given a budget, a staff, and a permanent space within this building to create a program based on the very principles she has already demonstrated: compassion, presence, and storytelling. This is not a request. It is not open for debate. This is the new direction of the company. Harrington rose from his chair, his face puce with fury. This is an outrage, an emotional, reckless decision. You are putting this company's reputation on the line for a sentiment. The investors will never stand for it. I will not stand for it. I will call for a vote of no confidence. Alistair did not flinch. He met the older man's enraged gaze with a look of pure, unadulterated steel. Then do it, Marcus, he said, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper. Call your vote, but know this: if you force me to choose between the soulless profit at all costs model you represent and a future where this company stands for something more than just its stock price, where it stands for basic human decency, then I will tender my resignation this afternoon. You can explain to the markets why the CEO who just delivered a record quarter has walked away. You can have this glass kingdom, but you will not have my daughter's heart, and you will not have Alara Vance. Silence. Utter, absolute silence. Every person in the room understood the ultimatum. He had just put his entire career, his entire creation on the table. He had called their bluff. Harrington stood there, sputtering, his power suddenly revealed for what it was, a hollow, brittle thing. He looked around the table, searching for allies, but found only averted eyes and stony expressions. He had been outmaneuvered not by a corporate raid, but by a father's love. Defeated, he snatched his folio from the table and stormed out of the boardroom, slamming the door behind him. In the silence that followed, one of the younger board members, a woman from the tech division, cleared her throat. "Alistair," she said, a small, genuine smile on her face. "I think the Leo's Bridge Foundation is the best idea this company has had in a decade. How can we help?" Alistair looked around the room and saw not opposition, but a dawning, reluctant respect. He had risked everything, not for profit or power, but for a principle. And in doing so, he had reminded them all that behind the glass and the steel, there were still human beings. He had won. The Winter Garden on the third floor was no longer forgotten. Over the next 6 months, it underwent a quiet, joyful transformation. The wild, tangled overgrowth was tamed but not erased. New, brightly colored cushions now dotted the old stone benches. Low, child-sized tables and chairs were nestled amongst the ferns, and the dusty cherubic fountain now gurgled with a soft, constant flow of clear water. The air, once still and heavy with neglect, was now filled with the gentle hum of children's whispers and the rustle of turning pages. This was the heart of the Leo's Bridge Foundation. Alara Vance moved through the space, not as an invisible janitor, but as its gentle, undisputed queen. She no longer wore the navy blue uniform of Oakhaven Facilities. Her attire was simple, soft trousers, a comfortable knit sweater, but she wore a quiet confidence that was more commanding than any power suit. Around her neck, on a delicate silver chain, rested a small, hand-carved wooden bird, a gift from Alistair. She sat on a large, colorful rug. A group of children gathered around her. There were children of all ages, the sons and daughters of executives and mailroom clerks alike. She was not reading from a book. In her hands she held 2 smooth gray stones from the garden. And so the little stone told the big mountain. She said, her voice the same soft storytelling cadence that had once captivated an audience of one. "You are tall and strong, it is true, but I have felt the warmth of a child's hand, and that is a different kind of strength altogether." A small boy with glasses giggled. Near Alara, helping a younger girl draw a picture of a mountain with a smiling face, was Serafina. The transformation in Sarah was the Foundation's truest miracle. The haunted, silent waif was gone. In her place was a bright, thoughtful 7-year-old. She was still quiet by nature, but her silence was now a comfortable, observant one, not a prison. She moved with an easy grace, quick to offer a crayon to another child or a comforting word to one who was shy. She was Alara's shadow, and her brightest apprentice, often whispering ideas for new stories into her ear. The storybird was no longer a desperate lifeline. It sat on a special shelf in the garden, a beloved mascot watching over its flock. Alistair often stood in the doorway just as he had in the beginning, but his reasons for watching had changed. He was no longer a desperate father searching for a sign of life. He was a man witnessing a quiet, profound magic he had helped bring into the world. He saw the easy camaraderie between the children, the relief in the faces of parents who could now bring their whole selves to work. He had fought a battle for his daughter, and in doing so had healed a small corner of his corporate kingdom. Lord Harrington had quietly resigned from the board a week after the confrontation, citing personal reasons. His absence was not mourned. One afternoon, after the last child had been collected by a grateful parent, Alistair stepped into the garden. Alara was stacking a small pile of books, her back to him. The setting sun streamed through the glass roof, bathing the room in a warm, golden light. "You've changed everything." "You know," he said softly. She turned a faint, genuine smile on her lips. "No," she corrected him gently. "They did." She gestured to the empty cushions, the scattered drawings. "Children know how to build bridges. We grown-ups just forget where to put the foundations." "You didn't just build a bridge, Alara," he said, taking a step closer. "You brought my daughter back across it. There is no way I can ever repay you for that." "It was never a debt, Alistair," she replied, her gaze steady and clear. "We found each other, 2 lonely souls who happened to be sitting in the same darkness. That's different." They stood in the quiet, comfortable silence that had become the hallmark of their relationship. It was a bond that defied easy definition. It was a partnership, a deep, abiding friendship, and something more, something that neither of them yet had the courage to name. "You know," he said, his voice a little hesitant, "the Foundation is being recognized. Other companies are calling, wanting to replicate the model. They want you to speak, conferences, panels. Alara shook her head slightly. I'm not a speaker, Alistair. I'm a librarian, a storyteller, but your story is the one they need to hear. A few weeks later, at the official launch event for the foundation, the main lobby was packed. Employees, investors, press, and a gaggle of excited children filled the space that had once been Alara's silent domain. She had agreed reluctantly to say a few words. When she stepped up to the microphone, a hush fell over the crowd. She looked out, not at the important faces in the front row, but at the children. For many years, she began her voice quiet but clear, amplified by the speakers. I lived in a world of silence. I cleaned rooms that people never noticed. I carried a sorrow that no one could see. I believed that my story was over. She paused, her eyes finding Sarah in the crowd. Sarah smiled and gave her a small, encouraging wave. But a story is never truly over as long as there is someone to listen. One day, a little girl sat with me in the quiet, and she didn't try to fix me. She just listened. She gave me back my voice. The room was utterly still. My story is not special, Alara continued. There are people like me all around you. In this building. In this city. People who move through the world in the quiet corners carrying stories you cannot imagine. They are not invisible. We have just stopped learning how to see them. Please, she implored, her voice resonating with a gentle, powerful plea. Look for them, see them, ask them for their story. You might just find that it's the one you've been waiting to hear. She stepped back from the microphone. For a moment there was silence. Then a single person began to clap. Soon the entire lobby was filled with a thunderous, heartfelt applause. In the crowd, Alistair put his arm around Seraphina's shoulders, pulling her close. She looked up at him, her face glowing with pride. Alara is more than just my friend, Daddy. She whispered, her voice full of a certainty beyond her years. He smiled down at her. What is she, sweetheart? Sarah looked towards the stage where Alara was now surrounded by a small group of children, each one vying for her attention. She's the one who taught the birds how to sing again. And at that moment, Alistair knew he hadn't just built a company. He had helped build a sanctuary, a place where broken things could be mended, where quiet voices could be heard, and where one woman's silent grief had blossomed into a story that had saved them all.